Well, good morning, ladies and gentlemen. On this Sabbath, July the 29th, 2017, here at the Congregation of Yahweh, Panama City, Florida. Well, it's a beautiful day. We got a little rain today, and we have a lot of sand in the soil here, and when it doesn't rain, it gets pretty dry pretty quickly. Today I'm going to talk a little bit about the non-obvious things about the book of Psalms. The biblical book of Psalms, which in Hebrew is M-I-Z-O-R, Mizor. You will see in the preference of Restored Name Bibles, Tillium, and that literally means praises. But the book of Psalms is the longest book in the Bible, and it's usually located in the center. So if you just take your Bible and flop it on the table, it'll open up almost every time to Psalms. Well, it's of course in the Old Testament, and it's but physically within the center of your Bible or nearabouts. Well, the Psalms are 5 collections of what may be called poetry or sacred songs. Poetry or sacred songs. And the collections consist of Book 1, 5 books, and it's believed that the 5 books is sort of a similar thing to the way that the Torah was divided. Book 1 covers Psalms 1 through 41. Book 2, 42 to 72. Book 3, 73 to 89. Book 4, 90 to 106. Book 5, 107 to 150. Now, each one of these ends with praises and a blessing to Yahweh. And they're unique in that respect. The Psalms are very old, and they span a period of about 1,000 years. 1,000 years. Some have titles, and some do not. They are a collection, and it appears that there has been more than one collection, and that the collections have been merged together, not taken and collated to have one set of psalms. And we know this because there's a lot of repetition in the psalms, as if they had been merged together. Well, about the 12th century, the book of Psalms was also known as the Psalter, and it was read in public worship and in private devotions. Among the Protestants in England, the Psalms were used principally as a hymn book. Depending upon the denomination singing the Psalms, that singing may have taken place with or without music. This is still true today, right here in Panama City. There's a group that sings a cappella, no music. In fact, they do not even allow a musical instrument within the confines of the structure. Poetry was of interest to educated people in the Middle Ages, since there was little else to read. Of course, they didn't have magazines and newspapers, and they certainly didn't have the internet. So educated people, as a mark of being educated, one had an interest in poetry, poems. And yet, today, few people read poetry. And even fewer know that what a psalter was, or what it referred to. Well, it was simply another reference to the book of Psalms. And in some cases, the Psalter was printed, or the Psalms were printed as a separate little volume that a person could carry around, since it was poetry. In religious services today, one does not commonly hear very many sermons on the Psalms. Most people find the Psalms difficult to read and sing because the words do not rhyme and they don't have meter. Further, the sacred name Yahweh has been substituted for capital G-O-D in their Bibles. And I make a point of this because they don't know it. They do not know what the sacred name of their Creator is. It's incredible. We take it for granted. We know it so well, it's just like second nature to us. But there is a lot of Sunday keepers that are out there, and Sabbath keepers today, who refuse to use, recognize, acknowledge the sacred name of their Creator and His Son. Well, by the end of the 70s and during most of the 1980s, the study of the Psalm became the subject of scholarly works. It's really kind of interesting that within this about 16-year period that there was sudden interest. A lot of it came about because the English department in colleges had programs, and part of those programs was called higher criticism. And they would look at the Bible. I guess they didn't have anything else to do, but they would look at the Bible and they would make up a set of rules, and then they would see how the Bible fit their set of rules, and as one would expect, it didn't hardly fit. So this was all part of people who denied the existence of the Supreme Creator, and they are still around. Well, some of these books were written by authors they're virtually unknown today, and yet they analyze the history and the composition and the structure of the Psalms, and their results of their efforts are worth knowing about. A virtually unknown book about the Psalms was printed in 1988 by the title, How to Read the Psalms. It was written by a person named Temper Longman III. And at that time, he was associate professor of the Old Testament at Westminster Theological Seminary in Philadelphia. And he was a Presbyterian and intended that his book would be used by college and seminary students in adult Sunday school classes and by individuals. Now remember, he was associate professor. He was not full professor. And back in that period of time, professors were sort of under the gun. You publish or perish. If you didn't publish a book about every 2 years, then you weren't professor there very long. And so this was one of his books. Regrettably, the sacred name, Yahweh, is rarely seen in Longman's book. However, he did compile the occurrences of the word Yahweh and Elohim from an English translation of the Psalms, which shows where the original words appear in copy of the ancient manuscripts. He has a little table, and within the 5 groupings, he counted up the number of times that Yahweh appeared, the name Yahweh, and the word Elohim appeared. Well, Longman referenced other authors' books, some of which are very detailed. And for an English major, I think they would just be happy. But like most academic books, How to Read the Psalms was not known when it was published and is even lesser known today. His book, An Aid to Understanding, 1971, is extensively excerpted in the following. Various psalms are excerpted from the Scriptures Bible, 1998. The Scriptures Bible, 1998, is one that you can download on your phone, on your mobile phone or your tablet. Non-obvious things about the book of Psalms. It is useful for believers to know non-obvious things about the book of Psalms. The book of Psalms consists of 150 poems written at different times by different authors. The numeration of the Psalms is kind of an interesting thing. There have been attempts to find separation points, like around David, and establish beginnings and ends. There's been no universal agreement, but what you have in your Bibles today is sort of a consensus of these divisions. The 150 Psalms that's in your Bible today appear to be a selection from a wider number of Psalms. And the reason for that is in the Hebrew and the Greek, sometimes there'll be 151. And the Eastern Orthodox Church, 151 is fairly common. The Peshitta, this is the Aramaic Bible, has 152 to 155 Psalms. 12 Psalms, Psalm 50, 73 to 83, are attributed to the musician Asaph, A-S-A-P-H, who served in the temple. Well, 73 Psalms are attributed to David, King David. 12 to Asaph, and remember, to serve in the temple, you had to be a Levite, and therefore we know that Asaph was a Levite, and apparently a very capable person, because being mentioned in the Psalms is recognition of a very, very high honor, accomplishment. Not everybody got a psalm, authored a psalm, or had a psalm that was later attributed to them. Although Asaph is credited with Psalm 79 and 80, they describe events later than Asaph's day. And so what that reflects is perhaps an editorial effort or a selection of psalms from a larger quantity toward collating them down to what could be called canonical. 12 Psalms, Psalm 42, 44 to 49, 84, 85, 87, and 88 are attributed to the sons of Korah. Now, Korah was rebellious. And I won't go into the history right now, but he has the house of Korah has a checkered past, and yet these sons here served in the temple. They were also Levites. One psalm each is attributed to Moses, Solomon, and Ethan the Ezrahite, E-Z-R-A-H-I-T-E, Ezrahite. Some people say that, well, actually, there's two psalms attributable to Solomon. It really doesn't make any difference. When one reads the Psalms, one is reading the Psalms, even if they had no author indicated. So out of the 150 Psalms, there's about 40 without attribution to an author. author. It's just blank. The poetry of the book of Psalms consists of parallel thoughts or expressions. And that is one of the ways that these people like Longman determined that there were collections of psalms because they were parallel. Oops. They were parallel. Acrostics, also called alphabetic psalms, are used in Psalms 9, 10, 25, 34, 37, 111, 112, 119, and 145. Some of the psalms are conclude with something called a collophon, colophon. And this is like little instructions to someone who's using the songs in a musical environment as to what to do. The acrostic psalms, in the acrostic psalms, the initial verse or verses of the first stanza begin with the Hebrew letter Aleph, Aleph. And if you turn to 119, Psalms 119, you can start to see there they begin with Aleph, the first letter of the Hebrew alphabet, and they continue on. Again, the acrostic psalms, the initial verse or verses of the first stanza begin with the Hebrew letter Aleph. The next verse or verses begin with Bet, and so on through all or nearly all of the letters of the Hebrew alphabet. And the arrangement, the reason this was done, may have been to aid the reader to memorize something, perhaps even the Hebrew alphabet. You'll see the word S-E-L-A-H, Selah, and it's seen pretty frequently in the Psalms and also in Habakkuk 3. Selah is generally taken to mean a pause, a suspension, or an interlude in singing and or playing of musical instruments. And the purpose seems to be to allow a period of silence for meditation and to let the emphasis sink in to the people. This pause was doubtless used to make a fact or a sentiment the psalmist had just expressed more memorable, or to allow the full importance of the psalmist's last utterance to sink in. The most quoted psalm in all of the Psalms is Psalm 22, followed by Psalm 69. And both of these songs are songs of lament. The word, if you see the word Selah accompanied by the word Hegion, it is understood that the psalm is associated with the music of the harp. Again, a lot of these things are not what some people would say are salvation issues. What they are is edification for the reader of the Psalms. And what they are is edification for the reader of the Psalms to impart that knowledge to people who don't know these things. And that's our duty, to go forth and spread the word. The Psalms were compiled at an early date. As I said, they were written over about 1,000 years from the time of Moses until the return of the Israelites from their Babylonian captivity. Since David composed many of the Psalms and organized the Levites into 24 courses to serve in the temple, it is reasonable to conclude that he started a collection of Psalms for use during service at the temple in Jerusalem. You get this clue from 2 Samuel 23:1, from 1 Chronicles 25:1 to 31, and 2 Chronicles 29:25 to 30. Thereafter, other collections of psalm must have been added to that which already existed. And this is inferred, again, as I said before, from the repetition found in the book of Psalms. For example, compare Psalm 14 with 53. Compare Psalm 40, 13 to 17, with Psalm 70, 57. And Psalm 7:11 with Psalm 108, verses 1 through 5. Numerous scholars believe that Ezra was responsible for arranging the books of Psalms into its final form. If you recall, that same opinion is voiced for the canonization of the Old Testament up through the time of Ezra. He arranged the books, and as I've said on other occasions, he changed from Paleo-Hebrew to square script Hebrew. And he did this, again, because there were various copies that had been copied because the original manuscripts had worn out. He did this to standardize the scriptures that were in the hands of the people. So if you had a scroll and it was written in Paleo-Hebrew, you had to question whether or not it was authentic. But if you had the same document in square script Hebrew, you would know that Ezra had gone through and perused the document, and it was the official document. Same thing, incidentally, occurred with the Quran, but not by Ezra. The order and the content of the book of Psalms and the Greek Septuagint version basically agree with the Hebrew text. Reasonably, therefore, the book of Psalms must have been completed before the 3rd century BCE, before the Common Era, when work on the Septuagint began. Recall, Septuagint was a translation that was commissioned by rabbis for the Jews that were living in the diaspora areas around the Mediterranean. The Dead Sea Palm Scroll provides evidence of the accurate preservation of the Hebrew text. You know, Dead Sea Scrolls were found about 1947, and although the Book of Psalms that was in that set is not 150, I think it was 47. What they did find was 41 rather. What they did find is they were basically the same. They corresponded on the text which most translations are based. The Psalms differ in modern times in 3 ways: chronologically, culturally, and theologically. Chronologically, the last psalm was written over 2,500 years ago, and of course the earliest about 3,500 years ago. Culturally, most of the people reading the Bible are Westerners, since their Bible is written in English. But the Psalms were originally addressed to Near Eastern Israelites. Accordingly, there are some customs and expressions that are strange to a modern technological society. Theoretically, the Psalms were written before Yeshua the Anointed was born, executed, and raised from the dead. The book of Psalms was written intermittently over the years, principally around the time of David. And that's basically all one has to remember. It was not canonized as a complete book until near the end of the Old Testament period. Well, there's canonizations and there's canonizations. And the Catholic Church took it upon itself to do a canonization. And that's reflected in the Catholic Bible. Formal grouping of the Psalms. The Psalms that make up the poems that make up the group of the book of Psalms were formally grouped in what today is called genres. Genres is a word used to characterize literary works by content, structure, and phraseology, i.e., categorize them. But the snooty people who are into literature and English and so forth, they can't use categorize. They got to invent a new word, genres. And therefore all the rest of us have to find out what genres means. Well, the Psalms are in the general genre of poetry, all of them. But there are 7 specific genres of the Psalms, and they are the hymn, the lament, the thanksgiving Psalms, the Psalms of confidence, the Psalms of remembrance, wisdom Psalms, and kingship Psalms. Hymns, the hymns. The genre of the hymns can be recognized by their exuberant praise of Yahweh. Although there are many different types of hymns, almost all share a similar basic structure. Hymns begin with a call to worship. Usually, this call is extended to other worshipers, but occasionally, as in Psalm 103, it is a call to the psalmist himself or herself to worship Yahweh. A frequent opening to a hymn is the simple command to praise Yahweh. In Hebrew is the familiar hallelujah. 2 words, hallelujah. Praise Yah, the shortened form of Yahweh, or the poetic form, Yahweh. Variation on the theme of the call to worship is a simple assertion by the psalmist that he will offer praise. I'll read now Psalm 92:1. It is good to give thanks to Yahweh and to sing praises to your name, O Most High. I read that as a continuous sentence because it is a continuous sentence. Yet, when you look in your Bibles, what you'll see is, it is good to give thanks to Yahweh, comma, and to sing praise to his name, comma, O Most High, period. So, if the line were continuous, a person who of average intelligence would read it, and it would be like other continuous sentences in the Bible. But these are grouped this way because they're often used and mostly used as hymns. B, the reasons for the praise. However, the form that's most significant, that is the reason for the praise is the part that's most significant. Yahweh is not praised for abstract qualities, but rather for the ways in which he has entered into the individual and the corporate level lives of his people. It's often easy to spot the transition from the call to worship to the reasons for worship. A hymn, because the latter, is usually introduced by the Hebrew conjunction ki, which stands for. And sometimes it's translated as because. So if you see a psalm, reading a psalm, and you see the word for, or you see the word because it's the Hebrew word ki. Hymns may be subdivided on the basis of the reason for the praise. Yahweh is often extolled as the Creator. Now, I know I've been going through some kind of detailed explanations here, but I'm doing it for 2 reasons. First of all, this is what guys like Longman do. They analyze things to death. However, the ordinary reader can read these things and start to see some semblance of order. But it's very useful sometimes to read what Longman and others have done, and you can start to see how the Psalms kind of fit together. Hymns may be subdivided on the basis of the reason for praise. Yahweh is often extolled as the Creator, and here's the Psalm 19, 1-4. The heavens are proclaiming the esteem of El, and the expanse is declaring the work of his hand. Yahweh is extolled as king in Psalms 47, 5-7. An interesting twist is seen in the Zion Psalms, which extol Mount Zion, not because of any greatness on its part, but because Yahweh has caused his presence to dwell there in a special sense in the temple, seen in Psalm 48, 1-2. C, the most important reason for praise given to the psalmist is certainly that Yahweh has delivered Israel out of distress. He has redeemed her from her enemies. D, they continue by expanding on the reasons why Yahweh should be praised. And this kind of gets to the point of why Psalms. E, hymns include and sometimes conclude with a further call to worship. Next category was the Psalms of Lament. The lament genre of hymns is primarily defined by its mood, the mood of the psalm. Psalms 22, 1-2. The lament is a psalmist's cry when in great distress and has nowhere to turn but Yahweh. There are three types of complaints seen in the lament psalms. So here, taking the entire corpus of psalms, they've gone through and they found out that there's psalms of praise and some with lament, and there'll be others I'll come to shortly. The psalmist now reads these psalms, finds they doesn't fit into all categories, and he comes to some conclusion about the psalms that deal with lament. He may be troubled by his own thoughts and action, and therefore the words stick out. He may complain about the actions of others against him, the enemies, and you see this in David's Psalms, and he certainly had reasons to write Psalms with the word enemies. The psalmist may be frustrated by Yahweh himself, or thinks that he is. Psalms 42, 5 and 11, 43, 5 illustrate three types of complaints which can be seen as a lament. First one, why are you depressed, O my being, and why are you restless within me? Psalm 42, 5 and 11 and 43, 5 for those who are making notes. It may also complain about his enemies. While they say to me all day, where is your Elohim? Psalm 42, 3. One of the difficult issues is interpreting the lament psalms when they refer to enemies. Some think the word enemies means the national enemies of Israel, and others as sorcerers, and others as accusers in a legal sense. Besides mood, lament psalms are united by a similar structure, and the following 7 elements are associated with a lament. 1, innovation. 2, plea to Yahweh for help. 3, complaint. 4, confession of sin or an assertion of innocence. 5, curse of enemies, and that word is also shown to be equal to the word imprecation, imprecation. 5, curse of the enemies, imprecation. 6, confidence in Yahweh's response. And 7, a hymn or blessing. Rarely will all 7 of these elements be in a single psalm. It's one example. Such a lament predominantly reflects a downcast mood, and it is surprising that all laments include some expression of trust in Yahweh. And that's key. Thanksgiving Psalms. The Thanksgiving Psalm genre is praise to Yahweh for answered prayer. A typical thanksgiving begins in a similar way to a psalm of praise, and the psalmist declares his intention to praise Yahweh. An example, this is Psalm 34:1. I will bless Yahweh at all times. His praise is continually in my mouth. Some thanksgivings, however, begin with a blessing, as in Psalm 32:1. Blessed is he whose transgression is forgiven, whose sin is covered. The Thanksgiving Psalm is most easily recognized by a restatement of lament, which by now has been answered. It's a lament which by now has been answered. The cords of the grave were all about me. The snares of death were before me. In my distress I called upon Yahweh, and to my Elohim I cried. Psalm 18, 5 or 6. Now the cords that they're talking about here is when a body was lowered into a hole in the ground. They didn't have caskets like we're familiar with. They would wrap the body in a shroud. They would pass some ropes underneath it, and they would lower the body down, and then they would pull the ropes out and fill in the hole. They used the word cords. The word ropes probably would have been a more optimum translation. The remainder of this Thanksgiving Psalm continues to praise Yahweh and to call on others to praise Him. Well, you have the Psalms of confidence, which express trust in Yahweh's goodness and power. And you have Psalms of remembrance. The genre of Psalms of remembrance is that which they frequently make reference to the great redemptive acts in the past. You're remembering something that happened in the past. And the two events which are cited frequently is one, the Exodus in Psalm 77:16, and the second is the establishment